Have you ever stopped to wonder why certain things only happen in certain places? Like how you can only see saguaro cactuses in the American Southwest, or how you can only see the northern lights if you go really far up north. Well, today we're going to be talking about why was Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance? And we're going to talk about how Italy's geographic location and its proximity to other places allowed it to be the home for this new rebirth. Today's goal, we're going to learn about the Renaissance. And first, we need to describe what the Renaissance actually was. And then we need to explain why the Renaissance started in Italy. But as we go through this lesson, there are some vocabulary words that I want you to pay special attention to. First, your academic words are proximity and classical. And then your domain-specific words are going to be secular, patron, Renaissance, and humanism. So as we go through this lesson, make sure that you listen for those words. Our lesson question for this lesson is, why was Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance? Now, to answer that question, first we're going to start out by taking a look at what the Renaissance really was and what it was all about. Then we're going to move on and take a look at why it started in Italy. But before we get started, let's take a look at a map of Europe during the beginning of the Renaissance in the year around 1400. Let's start out by taking a look at this map. This is Europe in the 1400s, or in the 15th century. And if you look closely, you'll see some places that you're probably still familiar with. Like here's England over here, or France right here. But if we take another look, there are some places listed on this map that don't even exist anymore. Places like Aragon right here, and Burgundy up here. But if you look even closer, you can see why the birthplace of the Renaissance was in Italy. If you look, Italy, right here, is close to all of its land neighbors, making it easy to transfer information and ideas. Also, if you take a look, you can see that it's surrounded by all of these seaports, making travel that much easier. Let's go back to our lesson question. Why was Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance? Well, we just looked at a map where you saw how easy it was to transfer ideas because of Italy's location. But now let's take a closer look at what the Renaissance actually was. All right, let's take a closer look at the Renaissance and see exactly what it meant. Well, the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. The Renaissance witnessed a rebirth of interest in education and the arts. Scholars renewed their interest in classical ideas. And when I say classical, I mean harkening back to Greece and to Rome. And people in this time, they shifted from a religious to a more secular perspective on life. When I say the word secular, I mean worldly. They noticed the world around them, and they took an interest in beauty and in people as individuals, not just the religious teachings that they had previously been brought up with. Let's take a look for a second and compare and contrast the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. Here I want to show you that I've broken this down for you in two different sections, and I've listed them out for you. It's really easy to contrast opposing ideas if you list them like this. So let's take a look. During the Middle Ages, education declined. That's important to remember. Political instability and the plague made it very difficult to obtain an education, and education was centered on religion. If you wanted to understand how the world worked, you went to church and you had a preacher or a minister reading to you from the Bible and telling you how the world worked in a more religious setting. Going over to the Renaissance now, we had an interest in classical learning that was being revived. This classical learning, remember, going back to Greece and to Rome. Works by ancient Greek philosophers were introduced. Educational opportunities increased for people, and interest in classical art and sculptures also began to grow. I want to point out that during the Crusades, a lot of these teachings from the Greek and the Romans were thought to have been lost, but the Arabs actually collected them and increased their trade with Italy, which allowed these ideas to flourish, and the Renaissance began. Now again, pointing out that in the Middle Ages, we're talking about people getting their education from their religious teachings, and in the Renaissance, people were learning for themselves, and they were taking an interest in nature and the things around them. Now, during the Middle Ages, European society was focused on religion. The Catholic Church was the most important political force during the Middle Ages. But then going over to the Renaissance, People became more interested in secular or worldly ideas. Independent monarchs began to increase their power. Scholars began to question the religious teachings that had been so normal for them in the Middle Ages. And people began to concern themselves with wealth and beauty. They wanted to live in beautiful places and in beautiful houses. And they wanted to take notice of themselves as individuals. And they wanted to become skilled in things like music and literature. So the big idea here, and the thing that I really want you to remember, is that in the Middle Ages, education was focused on religious teachings. But during the Renaissance, people were focused on classical teachings from the Greeks and the Romans, and they wanted to be invested in nature and in beauty. So to really understand what I mean when I'm talking about classical education, or hearkening back to the Greeks and the Romans, the first word that I want to focus on is humanism. And humanism focused on the potential of human achievement, the idea that all men could be capable of doing great and wondrous things. I want you to look over here. This is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci called The Vitruvian Man. And it just points out how people's interest in the human body were expanding during this time. Now, another idea behind the classical teachings in humanism is that reason, rather than religion, should guide one's thinking. Remember, in the Middle Ages, you got all of your education from the religious teachings. Now, you should use your mind. You should expand your mind. And classical text should be the foundation of your knowledge. You should start by reading the classics, read philosophy, see what the people of that time period had to say about life. Scholars should study a broad range of subjects. Now, the other important thing to remember about humanism is that humanist thinking impacted writers, philosophers, artists, and religious and political leaders during this time period. It was so important and prevalent that it was everywhere. Now, another important aspect of the Renaissance was the idea of being a Renaissance man. This is Leonardo da Vinci, and he was regarded as the quintessential Renaissance man. And a Renaissance man was a well-rounded member of society who excelled in many areas. And his abilities included being talented in many areas of study, things like languages, mathematics, history, and philosophy. Also, being able to sing, dance, play a musical instrument, and hold witty conversation. And also being athletic and skilled with the sword. Now, wealthy members of society began to concern themselves and focus on becoming more well-educated and proficient in many areas. And this idea is central to Renaissance humanism. Now, let's talk about the women for a moment. What did it mean to be a Renaissance woman? Well, the expectations for well-born women during the Renaissance were slightly different. Now, they were expected to be well-educated and charming and serve as good hostesses, but many had little political or economic influences, except for this one exception. This is Isabella d'Este, and she was actually known for her patronage of the arts. And she also actually ruled the city-state of Mantua in her husband's absence. So the big idea here is I want you to remember that the people of this time period in the Renaissance, they were focused on humanism, the idea of being able to achieve great things for themselves. And they all strove to be these Renaissance men and women who were proficient in many different areas and not just focused, as they were in the Middle Ages, on the religious teachings. All right, it's time to go back to our lesson question. Why was Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance? Well, we took a few moments to talk about what the Renaissance actually was, and we focused on the ideas of humanism and becoming a Renaissance man. And now it's time to actually talk about Italy's geographic location and what made it a prime home for the Renaissance. To understand more about why the Renaissance was taking its home in Italy, we want to look at the proximity to classical civilizations. And when I say proximity, I mean its geographical location. Italy was actually home to ancient Roman civilizations. The Romans had incorporated many elements of Greek art and architecture into their own models. And so these examples that had been there previously were available for Renaissance artists to study because they were already there. Now, trade routes are also extremely important during this time period. Italy was an important center of trade. classical scholars actually fled the Ottoman Empire and they settled in Italy. Now, when I say that, I mean that the Ottoman Empire, they had conquered the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the Arabs actually saved these works from the Greeks and the Romans, and they brought them with them to Italy, because almost all goods from the East came through Italy. You can see here these trade routes. Everything that comes from Constantinople eventually has to go through Italy. Now, that meant that the Italians became the first Europeans to rediscover and to focus on the written works of classical thinkers. Now, even though these items had been saved by the Arabs, I wanted to stress the idea that the Italians were the first to focus on them. Anyone can read words, but if you don't actually delve into their meanings, then you're just reading words off of a page. Another important aspect was urban Italy versus rural Europe. Now, compared to most of Europe, Italy was highly urbanized. I mean, there were a lot of cities. There was a lot of growth. And this environment contributed to the Renaissance because people often exchanged new ideas and ways of thinking. That was easy to do when you think about those trade routes. So many people were coming through those ports. It was easy to have other people to change those ideas with. Now, cities became centers for trade and banking. It increased their wealth and their ability to buy these pieces of art. Wealthy citizens could spend the money on art, books, and other luxuries and indulge in those things from humanism and naturalism. They were able to buy expensive and beautiful homes and take care of themselves as individuals. So wealth and these luxuries all contributed, along with the proximity of Italy itself, to becoming the new home for the Renaissance or the rebirth of classical ideas. All right, let's keep going and talk a little bit more about why the Renaissance was able to flourish in Italy. Now I want to talk about Italian city-states. Take a look at this map over here, and you can see these different colors. You can see these different areas. These were all broken down little sections of Italy, and they were called city-states. Well, Italy was divided into many small states, and each centered around a large city. These city-states actually established their own armies. They governed themselves, they collected individual taxes for themselves, and they were each controlled by a single family. Now, they were independent of any real central authority, and so this allowed these powerful families to emerge. Now, these powerful merchant families, the Italian city-states, were ruled by a growing merchant class. And the members of this class, they grew very wealthy and very powerful. They married into noble families and became leaders of the Catholic Church. Remember, the church was very powerful politically during this time period. They became important patrons of the arts. When I say the word patron, I mean someone who supports an artist financially. And also, they educated their sons in the classics. Now, merchant families, they sponsored artists. They were purchasing art from these different regions and these different artists, and they were moving them into their own city-states. And also, they began to educate their own sons with these classical teachings. This type of education began to grow, and as a result of that, dozens of universities were actually founded, and these ideas continued to be able to grow all through these city-states. Now, also, another reason for the expansion of the Renaissance was families like the Medici family. Now, Cosimo de' Medici, he ruled the city-state of Florence, Italy. His family controlled Florence for a very long time. He was one of the wealthiest people in Europe during his lifetime. He worked in textiles, and he also opened a very large bank. He built palaces, and he built libraries in order to beautify Florence. Remember those ideas of humanism and naturalism. People wanted beauty around them, and he was a very good judge of talent in painters and writers. Now, these powerful patrons, like the Medici family, they became church leaders, actually, who brought their own patronage of artwork to the church. That's important to remember because the Catholic Church was actually one of the biggest and most important patrons of the arts during the Renaissance. The church itself wanted to beautify itself and to appeal to the people, almost like it had in the Middle Ages, but still by allowing those ideas of humanism and naturalism to flow. When we put this on a timeline, we can really see how some of these events played out. We can see that in 1429, Cosimo de' Medici was rising to power in Florence, right in the middle of the Renaissance. Him and others like him who supported the arts led to things like the Gutenberg printing press being invented, and also Michelangelo being able to finish his painting of the Sistine Chapel, all the way up until 1517 when the Reformation officially began.